Okay, so we are going to move into part number one. Now, remember, the first thing you got to do is really have the message, but part number one that we're going to talk about in the course here is the mind shift. So, there's going to be 11 mind shifts we're going to go to. We're going to do these in 6 different lessons. So, the first 5 lessons have 1 and 2, and then 3 and 4, 5 and 6. Finally, the 11th mind shift will do it all on its own. This one is really 1 and 2, these fit together. The idea is you created the message, so keep it and continue developing that message. Now, several years ago, I went on this trip with an MLM, multi-level marketing company. We had placed 8th in the world and won an all expenses paid trip to Hawaii. Now, while we were there, I got to meet the founders of the organization, got to see the business model and how it works, got to meet some other distributors, got to see where they create all these products. That was not the biggest takeaway. Now, for sure, some great things happened from that trip. But while I was on that trip, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it as we keep going, there were 3 things that I stumbled upon while I was on that trip. The first one was this, is you can actually escape the 9 to 5. There is a way to move out to where you're not doing this daily grind. For sure, you got to work. When people say, well, I want passive income, and there's not really any passive income. At some point, you've got to do the work and maintain the work to move forward. But you can step out of this thing where you have to show up at a certain time and then you quit at a certain time. You can actually escape the 9 to 5. And we saw people on that trip who were doing that. They had kind of leveraged their time and their energy and their focus through network marketing, which is not the only way to leverage to escape the 9 to 5. Here was another lesson that I had learned is you can actually develop multiple streams of income that would serve you and your family. Now, until that point, I had just assumed that if you want multiple streams of income, that means that you have a job and your spouse has a job. And that's the multiple streams of an income. You're both doing something full-time, 9 to 5. But what we saw on that trip was, hey, you can develop multiple streams of income by having your work leveraged out there in different ways. The third thing I learned was actually this, is you can make money, a lot of it, doing something you enjoy. Now, at the time, I was involved in a nonprofit. I was working in ministry. I loved what I was doing, but I was not making a lot of money. I was kind of stuck in that 9 to 5. For me, it was more like the 7 to sometimes 7. I was working, 12 hours a day many times, sometimes 70, 80 hours a week. And I just assumed if I was going to make a lot of money, it would not be something I enjoyed. I would have to kind of step out of what I was called to do, step out of what I really felt my purpose was, and do something completely different. Again, now I learned all of those things happened to be just some mind shifts for me. Here's what I did. While I was there on that trip, I'm learning about the business, I'm learning about that particular organization and their business model. I decided while I was on the trip that one of the best things I could do was just write a book. And so the purpose of writing that book was I was going to show other guys in particular how to work a business in an industry that is typically something that you would think women are involved in. And so I was just going to show guys, hey, here's how you can do it. It's not necessarily feminine. You could do it as a man. There are a lot of guys who do this business successfully. Again, home-based business. You kind of think like Tupperware, Amway parties. So this was essential oils and vitamins and supplements and that sort of thing, showing guys how to do this and how it could really serve their family on several levels. So I wrote the book, and after I wrote the book, I started selling the book at events where I would be speaking. These were smaller training events. I sold the book on my website. At that point, I'd probably sold 100 books or so. In fact, people would routinely, and it was a very rudimentary website, they would order the books, and just about every day or two, I would go to the post office. This is our youngest boy, Salter, who's now 9, almost 10 as of the recording of this. And he figured out pretty quick that if I was going to the post office after dropping the kids off at school, that meant drop the kids off at the school, post office, coffee shop. And so he had figured out he could do, drop the kids off at school, post office, coffee shop, cheese Danish, milk, that sort of thing. So he started making every single trip, and that just started becoming his routine and my routine. Now, this was a significant turning point for me. As I was writing that book, the COO at the time of the organization, I'd met him on the trip to Hawaii, and I kept emailing him and texting him. Really, there was nothing I wanted from him. I was just fact checking. Like, hey, is this accurate? Have I presented this person in the right way? Have I talked about this farm or this location and this timeline, this history accurately? And so he really became my de facto fact checker and would send me back information and say, hey, like, yeah, maybe change it in this way, or hey, the year's off a little bit right there. And so I had some great interaction with the guy that was the COO. And so eventually one of my exchanges was this. I've got the book done. I'd sent him a copy, sent some of the other executives of that company a copy. Can I get the book into the company's annual convention? I'm just assuming the answer is probably no. And it's okay because I wrote the book just to share with other guys that were in my organization to teach them how they could grow their own business. But what happens is within about 10 minutes, he sends me an email back and says, absolutely, here's what you need to do. Call this person, gave me the girl's name. Here's the number. She's expecting to hear from you. So I got on the phone, instantly. I remember I was sitting at Starbucks over off of, near the Homewood exit off of Highway 65 there, Lakeshore. And so I phoned and instantly she says, can you send me 1,000 books? And so I'm thinking, well, goodness, I've sold like maybe 100. How can I send her 1,000? well, here's what I'd done is I had published the book through, it was CreateSpace at the time. That was Amazon's forerunner of KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing. That means you self-publish the book, you own all the rights, you have it yourself. And so what I could do is I could go into the back office of KDP and then I could order the books. And ideally you'd have those books sent to you. But I could drop ship them, and instead of sending them to me for $3.50 a piece, I could send them to her. In fact, I could send them directly to the shipping loading dock where the convention was being held. So 1,000 books, I go back in to the back office of KDP, CreateSpace at the time. I pay $3.50 per book for 1,000 books, $3,500-ish, send them an invoice. We agree on the price. I clear about $6 a book. They send me 8 to 10 days later, the check arrives in the mail. I've got it, I've deposited it, I pay off the business credit card, and I net about $6,000 just for something that I never even touched. Now, here's the bigger lesson. Let me talk about my experience of that, which was completely random and I think was just this big godsend that happened compared to other authors. One well-known author that I know of, he received a $30,000 advance and explained why he couldn't quit his day job. Now, here's where that happened. John Acuff, great writer, he talks about his first book, Stuff Christians Like. He built it on the back of his blog that he released back in 2009, 2010. He wrote the book and he received a $30,000 advance for writing that book based on blog content, which is something that we're going to talk about a few videos from now. So he writes it and everybody automatically assumes, well, you got your book published, you got $30,000. Are you going to now quit your day job? And he says, well, I can't. And everybody's, well, why not? And he says, well, here are the reasons why. Because it took me about a year to write that book. So $30,000 in a year is not enough to feed and support my family. And then once you write the book with a traditional publisher, it takes about a year to get that book from when you turn it in as a manuscript through the editing phase to print. So now I've got some more runway that I've got to live off of this. Plus, even though he would never have to return this amount to the publisher, all of the royalties before he would get any more had to first recoup their expenses for all of this. So again, he's not going to have to return any if the royalty check would be $29,000. He's not going to ever owe them anything, but he's not going to make any more until the royalties would exceed that after the publisher has made back all of their money. Now, here's the thing you got to go is book publishers are in the business to make money, and the publishing industry is driven by sales. It's not driven by artists. It's not driven by writers. It's driven by people that have to make a profit. That's not a negative thing. If they don't turn a profit, they can't stay in business. If they don't stay in business, that means no more books. And so it has to, in some sense, be driven by salespeople, but it shows you why you can't necessarily quit your job. That was 2 years of work to achieve this. And then you got to write another book. You got to keep this thing going and find more customers. And by the way, most people don't get an advance. Most people don't arrive at this sort of deal. Here's another example. I had a friend, he was at the same convention that my book showed up at. And he came up to me and he said, I remember this conversation we had. He said, hey, did they publish your book as well? Now, I had sold my book to a publisher, not sold the rights to it. I sold them physical copies of 1,000 books. And he said, did they publish your book too? It was a great question. And I'm not sure why he asked it, because the assumption would have been that they did publish it. But from that conversation, I learned a whole lot. He said, yeah, like they published mine and here's how it's working. He didn't get an advance. Remember, most people don't. He was getting 50 cents a book profit that would reconcile at the end of every month based on the sales. And he was thrilled. This was a great deal because when